So, Natalie, welcome to this online regional conference. I understand from Martin that we're the first region to have such an event, which is fantastic. I also have a feeling in these very strange times that we as a party are actually much better at having these sorts of events online, because I think that's the way we seem to have worked for in many things, but perhaps those of you like you, Natalie, who are more in the sort of political down in Westminster would be able to comment about that. But I feel as though we're kind of ahead of the curve in being able to have these sorts of events, which is fantastic. And I'd also like to say hello to everybody else who's out there, even though we can't see you. So, Natalie, I don't know what more I need to do to introduce you really as our former leader and now as a member of the House of Lords. So I'm just going to pass this over to you really to talk to us about a Green's place in the Lords.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, and thank you everyone who's come along on a Sunday morning. It's interesting, I was just come off another call, another talk I was giving to Fashion Revolution, and one of the things we were reflecting on that was how few, relatively to other parts of Europe, how few young people there are involved in British politics in general. And of course, you know, the House of Lords is the extreme end of that, given that the average age of the House of Lords is 70 in stats that just came out from the library a couple of months ago now. When I came in with the Lords, and a couple of the people who came in at the same time as me were Tories who'd been members of Theresa May's staff. And there was much harumphing from the long-termers about some of them are only 40-something. How can this be? But the other thing, you know, I think it's worth saying about the House of Lords is that there's lots of critical things to say, and I will undoubtedly say lots of critical things now, but sometimes it does work surprisingly well. And I think, you know, I think you're right in terms of political parties that the Green Party is ahead of the curve here. And I've been doing lots of events all around the country, and I'm actually, you know, I've discovered that Zoom fatigue really is a thing. It really does exist. And I'm going to have to try and work out how I balance that up somewhere along the line, because of course I can visit any local party, and I'm happy to do that now, but that means my diary gets very, very full. But the House of Lords has at least partly gone virtual. And so we have for a week now been conducting oral questions and some other sessions by this kind of method by Zoom. And, you know, the political journalists have had lots of fun making fun of Lords stabbing at their thing, going, how do I unmute this thing? It doesn't work. What's happening? Where's my grandchild? But actually, you know, considering the population we're working with, the House of Lords has done pretty well, and people are getting better at it, as you'd expect. So, you know, one of the things we've demonstrated, and Caroline's been saying this about the Commons as well, is, you know, so many things that were considered, we couldn't possibly change that, that's not possible, it can't be done, have had to be done. And that's a really positive thing. So, you know, the House of Lords, it's often mocked. The Green Party, of course, the first thing I did after I'd made my maiden speech was to go and present my elections for the House of Lords bill, which had its first reading and was scheduled for its second reading at the end of the year. Unfortunately, that might change now, but you know, of course, we're trying to change it. But in the meantime, what we can do is use it to make as much impact as possible. And there are a lot of good people in the Lords. I came in with Sir Simon Woolley from Operation Black Vote. We, both Caroline, Jenny and I work a lot with John Bird from he was the founder of The Big Issue. He's working very hard and doing a lot of work on trying to get for England a Future Generations Act like Wales has. And although Wales is not as strong as it might be, it was the Future Generations Act there that helped to stop the extension of motorway, the bypass down in South Wales. So, you know, it's a potential real tool to bring sustainable development goals, to bring thinking about the future in. And John Bird is the crossbench peer who's leading on that. So what I'm planning to do is I'm planning to talk for about another 10 minutes about some of the things that I've been doing, what's happening in the Lords, and then allow plenty of time for questions and discussion, because I always believe that dialogue's better than monologue, a phrase some people on this call have probably heard me say before. But at the House of Lords, at the moment, the key thing that we're able to do is to ask the government questions. That operates through two main ways. The first is written questions. So if you looked me up on the House of Lords website, you'll see I asked a whole range of questions last week, written questions that the government has to answer within 10 working days. And they ranged across things from, one of the things I've been thinking about is, food security is going to become an increasing and pressing issue as the coronavirus crisis goes on. And we're right in the middle of the growing season. I actually managed to get some time into my allotment and knock down at least some of the stinging nettles yesterday. If we're going to grow food in Britain this year, it really needs to start now. So one of the questions I'm asking is, what's the government doing to give people access to land, communities access to land, so that they're able to grow food? Now, I'm not necessarily expecting a huge, positive, exciting answer from the government on that, but it's a starting point of something that I will hope to work with organisations like UK Sustain, with the Land Workers Alliance, to take that forward. So the asking the question is the first step in the process. I've also got a written question in asking about how many nurses, midwives and associated health professionals who were should have been finishing their final year now, but have been asked to go into the health service and work early, asking how many people have done that. And I'm also on Monday going to table a question that someone's pointed out to me. It's really unclear the status of people who, for whatever reason, haven't been able to do that, what's going to happen with their degrees and their courses, and what's going to happen with their fees. And that relates to something that I've been working on for some time, calling for those nurses, midwives and associated health professionals who are the ones who've been hit hardest by fees. They've both had to pay fees and had no grants to support their living costs. They've only had loans. And they are a cohort that year is the worst off of any year. So, for example, for the ones who are coming in at the end of this year, we'll have a up to £5,000 living grant. So, I'm really looking at that cohort and talking to lots of people in that cohort. So asking written questions is one of the things I can do. This week is a particularly exciting one because you can put in one a month oral questions. And this is where you get to ask the minister a written question that he or she already had a response to. And then you have a chance to come back with a supplementary question, usually in the House, but now on, at the moment, Microsoft Teams. And then other people come in on the same question. So some people might have seen a piece I wrote for Politics Home about a question I had in just before we went into recess about how will we overcome growth addiction. And I got an interesting blunt answer in writing from the minister saying, we celebrate our growth addiction, we love our growth addiction. So now I've got a follow-up saying, well, not quite, it doesn't quite say this, but you have to make the terms of the question parliamentary, but the underlying question is, so now we're going to see something like a 30% fall in GDP. How are you going to guarantee people's prosperity without growth? And all of this, of course, relates to the work of Tim Jackson and others and the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Prosperity Without Growth. And so by asking the minister questions, by forcing the government to engage with the work of Tim Jackson in his institute, we're really pushing the debate forward. One of the other things that I will have this week, it's quite a busy week, is you can also put down, and it's a ballot, so it's pure chance whether you get it, is a question for short debate. So there's an hour-long debate in which I'll get about 10 minutes to speak, and other lords can put in to speak, which basically says, how is the government guaranteeing no one is left penniless during the coronavirus crisis, which is, of course, a chance to bring in universal basic income and the big petition, which is out there that can be signed now. I'll put a link in the chat box actually afterwards, about the universal basic income and a recovery universal basic income. So that I will get the House of Lords for an hour essentially talking about universal basic income, which I don't think has ever happened before that I'm aware of, certainly not recently. So those are the kind of things that I can do in the House of Lords, that we can get in and ask questions and challenge and scrutinise the government. What we would normally be doing is also looking at legislation, trying to get changes, modest improvements to legislation. We're not quite sure what's happening with that because they haven't yet sorted out remote voting. and dealing with legislation will require remote voting. I don't think it's really that difficult. I mean, I've been saying since the start of March that we'd have to have remote voting. I had a piece in the Independent about it. And I mean, the European Parliament, clunky, but what they were doing was emailing a ballot paper to members, and then members were filling in the ballot paper, taking a photo of and emailing it back, which does seem remarkably clunky for 2020, but nonetheless, it worked. It's doable. It doesn't require people to have a high level of technology or even a good, strong internet connection. So, you know, it's possible to do that. And for example, one of the things that's coming up is the next stage of the pension schemes bill. And I've actually just had an email in my queue from the minister. We've been pushing to get the pension schemes bill, to get the dashboard in which you'll be able to see all your pensions in one place, to get measures of the environmental impact of your pensions in that. So very soon, again, I would expect we'll be able to make changes to legislation. And then the third thing that we can do, of course, is just because you are a member of the House of Lords, you do get opportunities, you get asked to do things, people pay attention to you in a way that they wouldn't if you weren't. I have to admit to not being 100% comfortable with this. It's, you know, it's not the way I think the world should work. I think, you know, as I've often said, everyone in the Green Party is a leader and we should value everyone equally. But it's a practical reality that does open spaces up for the Green Party that wouldn't be open otherwise. And that's something that, you know, certainly I aim to use whenever I can. So I think being in the House of Lords, people often ask me, you know, what one word description is. It's a very, very strange place. It's both incredibly, incredibly archaic. I mean, it's interesting that not walking around the corridors and seeing all those sort of archaism of men in tail jackets and tights and swords waving around the place. I keep meaning to ask Black Rod if the sword is actually sharp, because it does rather look like it is. It's weird that the crisis of having to operate remotely has taken some of the strangeness away. It's also seen innovations that are positive, that really potentially can make a difference. And there's a sort of broader political message in here, which I think is really worth focusing on and thinking about, is the nature of change and how change can happen. And, you know, I've been saying this, I was talking to LBC last weekend, and we were talking about, of course, in terms of the environment, you know, people are noticing how clean the air is, how there either seem to be more birds around, or certainly we hear them more. All of the impact of people getting together in their communities and helping each other. We've seen the nation, just like that, change absolutely enormously. And that's under crisis conditions. And we've been being told as the Green Party for decades, oh, you know, well, things are like this, and, you know, change, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen very slowly and gradually. And actually, you know, we've seen the possibilities of enormous changes and the hope for the future. Obviously, the climate emergency hasn't gone away. No one really seems to be noticing the weather at the moment, but it is actually, on my allotment in Sheffield, it is incredibly dry. I was digging into the soil yesterday and it felt more like an Australian wheat field in summer than what I would expect soil in Yorkshire to be. We are seeing, you know, I was actually just seeing Central Europe is apparently heading into what looks like a really severe drought. It would be easy to say, oh, isn't it terrible, we've got to deal with the climate emergency and the coronavirus and other things. But there is, in this massive, tragic, enormous disruption, also the possibility for massive, constructive, positive change. And the House of Lords is a part of that. One of the speeches I gave very early on, going back to where we started from, reflecting on the fact of there's so few young people in British politics compared to most of continental Europe. The Commons is not representative of the people of Britain. 44% of people voted Tory, and they got 100% of the power in the Commons. I said to the House of Lords, particularly talking about the climate emergency, that you have to be the opposition and you have to represent your grandkids and your great-grandkids. So the House of Lords is a place, perhaps counterintuitively, that we can really drive change from, that we have to use. And I know some people, you know, question whether we should take up seats in the Lords, but you know, we got in the last election 760,000 votes. So Caroline, Jenny and I, between us, each represent about 260,000 voters. On that basis, we represent a lot more people than any MP does. So I make no apologies for being in the House of Lords. And I did actually have to laugh because I had to go down on Tuesday because there was a discussion about procedures which you could only take part in from the chamber. And I thought it was important that I be there because there are some aspects, some detailed technical aspects of the way the new arrangements have been made that threaten to make the Lords less democratic. And so I went down and made my comments about this. And as is often the case, we definitely get a very disproportionate share of reaction from ministers when they're responding to backbench speeches because we shock them and surprise them and go further than anybody else. And so Lord Ashton of Hyde was responding for the government on the procedures and, you know, said something along the lines of, well, the Greens get a greatly disproportionate share of the time in the House anyway. And the whole House, the people who were there all kind of smiled and nodded. And so I've been, you know, looking forward to imagining Lord Ashton of Hyde's face when he saw that I had both the questions for short debate and the oral question next Thursday. So, you know, I think we are making impact there in the Lords, and we look forward to making a much bigger one, including changing the whole place and making it an elected House. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for a fascinating talk about the work you're doing, which is really is so very valuable. I mean, I'm aware that you know, there's debate, yes, about whether we should take up our places in the Lords, but it is so important. I think we just need to have a voice wherever we possibly can, and that's the opportunity. Right. So what I would like to do, Natalie seems to have disappeared. Oh, you are there. Thank you. Okay, so what I'd like to do is, well, first of all, actually, no, my point. I agree with you. Allotment. I mean, the allotment has been, for us, the beneficiary of this. What happened to April showers? The allotment is so dry to be having to water at this time of year, but it is good to be there. So before my little comment there about allotments and things, I did wonder, you're quite right, it is good to have some discussion. And I think the first two questions that are coming one was from Tom Franklin, and another one was from Andy de Gorn. So what I was going to suggest is that they actually ask those questions themselves rather than me repeating them, if that's okay. Tom first then.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalie. Great to hear from you and see just how much you're getting done in the House of Ladies, as it maybe ought to be renamed. One of my great concerns is that we've got some emergency legislation in. Now, the last time we had some emergency short-term legislation was the Prevention of Terrorism Act, passed in 1974 and not repealed till 2000, by which time most of the provisions have been incorporated into other laws anyway. How are we going to prevent, or how are you as a law going to prevent that happening again? Because there are some extremely worrying things in the emergency legislation, and I'm concerned that it could be there for 24 years and incorporated into ordinary law by then. Thanks.
Yeah, and this was, you know, expressions of concern. We were still physically in the House when we were debating this before recess, and you know, it is actually a sign of what pressure from the Lords can achieve, because what the government originally wanted to do was to have this legislation operative for 2 years and then have a review. What eventually happened was pressure from the Lords and the Commons as well, is that we are now somewhat imperfectly, and it's technically, there's some question technically precisely what it means, and it will depend on what the Commons does and what the Lords does, but there is now at least a 6-month review. So it doesn't just come in for 2 years and we're stuck with it, which then kind of embeds things to the point where it's very hard to reverse them. I mean, the practical reality was there was simply, the government had to be allowed to get that through. There was a huge amount in it of utterly uncontroversial technical stuff. There was something that had to be changed about the registration of pharmacists in Northern Ireland, which I never bothered to get my head around, but the Northern Ireland Greens told me it was fine, so just let it through. But it's something to really be watched. And the legal commentator David Allen Green, who writes for the FT and is very highly respected, it's a very technical issue, so I'll refer anyone who really wants to know about this, what I'm about to say, to his blog. But basically, what's subsequently happened is the government has changed the statutory instrument, which basically sets out the detailed conditions of the lockdown. And originally what that statutory instrument said was that you can't leave your home without lawful excuse. They've actually, without any reference to anyone, changed that statutory instrument to say, or remain outside your home without lawful excuse. Now, on one level, this is technical and kind of cleans up the thing whereby if you left for a lawful excuse and didn't go home for 3 days, then that's a legally fudgy area. And I'm not a lawyer. I'm sure there are other people on this call who know a lot more about law than I do. But the fact that the government changed what's really kind of key bit of the statutory instrument is a real worry. And Jenny and her team, because that's civil liberties is kind of her area, one of the ways we work in Parliament is Jenny, Caroline and I kind of divide up all subjects between us so that we each cover a third, very roughly speaking. So civil liberties is Jenny, and her people are looking at that and seeing what can be done, trying to see potentially whether we might get a topical oral question on it. So we're watching it very closely. We got the 6 month review thing through, which was a joint effort by lots and lots of people. It's a risk, and I probably should anonymize this because it was kind of in those circumstances, but I was actually at a meeting of all of the opposition parties as talking about how we manage the bill through the Lords. And let me put it this way, someone who was a very prominent Blairite kind of said, oh, well, with the Lords, we can't stop the Commons doing whatever they want. And my response to that was, but we have to think about, with the current government, but under any circumstances really, if we had people really, demonstrably with bad intentions, simply to trying to take control and get rid of any democratic methods that we have now, what is the House going to do about it in that situation? And his response to this was, well, yeah, but we can't really do anything about it. And my answer is, I will be in there fighting every step of the way and do whatever I have to do to step in that kind of situation.
Thank you, Natalie. Tom, was there anything you wanted to ask further?
No, I mean, it's just a comment that the Prevention of Terrorism Act actually also had a sunset clause in it and did have to be repassed each time. So the fact that this has got a 2-year sunset clause and needs 6 monthly reviewing doesn't give me huge hope.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you, Tom. Andy DeGorn in York has asked a question. You're not in York, okay.
No, I said I am in York. Another one in York.
Okay. Has asked a question about quarantine and open borders. I wonder whether you'd just like to ask Natalie that yourself.
It was something highlighted by one or two Facebook posts from who've been through Heathrow Airport recently. Like other airports around the world, no checks or quarantine procedure or anything like that, other than a piece of paper saying that if you feel unwell, you should self-isolate for 14 days. I'm just thinking in terms of if whatever stage is a relaxation, seems to be the message from is can't we've sort of reached the point where move on to testing, back and contact tracing. We like to be very much lockdown. It seems to me that airlines are sort of saying they need to be held out for the, and I think there was a news report yesterday of one of saying
Sorry,
starting a
I
fight.
think we're having problems with Andy's
Yeah.
sound. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Okay, I think, Natalie, did you get the
you
gist
got
of
the
the...
gist of it, have you?
I think I got the gist of it. I'll try and answer and do come back and
Thanks.
we can give it a go. You might want to switch your video off when you come back, if you're coming back, and that often makes the sound better. But in terms of, if I got it right, the question of, there hasn't been any measures at airport as people have been coming in. I mean, there are, of course, very few people coming in. I had a friend who sort of came back on an emergency flight from New Zealand, and, she was saying just how incredibly empty and how few people there were around Heathrow, etc. I did actually see a headline this morning, I'm afraid, because I've been doing other things. I haven't caught up with everything, suggesting they were going to introduce compulsory quarantine for anyone coming in from outside the country. But I think, the practical reality we have to look at this is, at the moment, for most of the world, someone arriving from another country, for example, my friend arriving from New Zealand, is less of a risk than any Britain. The infection rates are actually considerably lower in most parts of the world than they are here. So, that's obviously something that's going to change and something we're going to have to think about. But I have actually been thinking about, the situation, because there's been a huge amount of short-term thinking, and continues to be a huge amount of short-term thinking. We have to be thinking about, 12 to 18 months at the absolute earliest for a widespread vaccine available for use. There is no guarantees. One of the problems that we do also have to have thinking about is people have been trying to create an HIV vaccine for decades and haven't succeeded. So we do also have to put some thought into thinking about how we manage things if there isn't, we never manage to get a coronavirus vaccine. And as Greens, there are some real issues here to think about, because if we apply forever a 14-day quarantine for anyone coming into the country, that has massive, massive potential implications for inequality. Rich people, if they want to do this, will be able to do this. A poor person who wants to fly in for their parents' funeral, he doesn't have that sort of time to spare. That's another question altogether. So, I think there's kind of stages of thinking here, and I fear there's been very little of the long stage thinking, and I don't have any answers. And there's still so many questions we don't know about infection rates around the world, about transmission rates, about asymptomatic transmission. There's more questions than answers on all of those technical kind of things. But we've really, as Greens, one of our jobs is to really think about, what will the impacts of this be in long-term different future scenarios? And we're always asking, what will the equality, how will this affect poor people versus rich people? How will this affect people who are more vulnerable for one reason or another? It's a difficult situation, and we've really got to be cautious of suggesting we either know the answers, or that we found this is it, we must do this. We need to actually have thought through a range of scenarios in every area and everything we're working on with this.
Okay, thank you, Natalie. Did you want to come back on any of that, Andy? Now I see you've got your headphones on. In which case we might move on. So Martin's been supporting me on this and looking at the questions that have come in. So Martin, would you like to ask Natalie the next question, please?
What I'd like to begin with is one of the questions that was emailed in earlier for Jonathan, because we asked the questions for that, because I thought it might be appropriate in view of your previous engagement, which was, what are the Green Party's plans to tackle fast fashion, from Emma Illingworth?
Yep. Well, yes, I spent an hour talking about this earlier this morning. I'll try and boil all that down. I mean, what I was saying there was something some other people might have heard me say before, which is, the £5 t-shirt in Primark the real cost is not £5. It has massive externalized costs for everything from the child in Azerbaijan picking the cotton when they should be in school, through to all the fossil fuel to ship that round the world, to the Chinese factory spilling dye into the river, to the Bangladeshi garment factory and all the social suffering associated with that, to the minimum wage 0 hours contract worker in Primark who's selling it. And so what we have to do is move towards a situation where the price tag reflects the real cost of things. But of course, the other side of that is, you know, lots of people maybe who've got a job interview on Monday who need a white t-shirt can only afford that £5. They have no more money in their pocket. And so it's the kind of Green Party problem that everything's interrelated to everything else. The other thing that very much came up in the discussion this morning, which I think is sort of an interesting side issue that's not the immediate obvious answer, but is really worth thinking about, is the question of the education system and advertising. And so people in schools get huge numbers of consumerist messages and messages about your life being about passing exams and getting qualifications to get your job, and that's what your learning's for. And that really doesn't equip people to live, to create art or craft or music, maybe professionally, but just in your life. And, you know, we're bombarded with messages, and the chair was telling me they've discussed this a lot, messages saying, you know, buy something and you'll feel better about yourself. And actually you buy something and you feel worse. And so as always with green things in tackling fast fashion, we're talking about practical things about the fashion industry and ensuring people don't impose costs on the rest of us. But there's also about creating a different kind of society where people can get rewards and satisfaction in life in different ways other than buying things, and being taught that that's possible, which very often people aren't at the moment. But what we've got to be careful of is, you know, we do not want to lecture that person buying the £5 t-shirt and say, you shouldn't do that. You know, my only response to the person who's done that is good luck in the job interview on Monday. Because, you know, you've done what you need to do to get the best result you can for you at this moment. We're not concerned with individual behaviour, we're concerned with system change.
Right, thank you for that. There was a very similar area, which was from Ruth Love on chat, which was about the countries we're importing from, where there are shortages themselves. Is that linked area of development economics? I don't know if you might want to comment on that, but there's another question from Kay Horsfield, which again overlaps in Sheffield. What can we do to move forward to a fairer society post-COVID? And I think that links to Ruth's concern about import from countries that can't really afford to export.
Yeah, well, I think one of the exciting things about our current situation is that the whole Green Party debate, sort of policies we've long been propounding about localization and, you know, reshoring, making sure that lots of the things we consume and use in our life are locally made, have suddenly become utterly mainstream debates. And, you know, I think we will definitely see a reshoring of production of PPE around the world. Now, I think, you know, there's some risks and some dangers in this, and we've got to be a bit careful about who we get allied with and who we're supporting, because, you know, there will be some countries in the world who simply don't have the capacity to produce their own PPE, and we have to make sure that supplies are available to them as well. So it's a balance thing. And, you know, you don't necessarily, the most highly technical form of ventilators, for example. I mean, I think the whole chaos around ventilator production in the UK was a really interesting case study, because what we saw was the government in a very classic way chasing the celebrity model of production. Go and find Dyson, you know, he's a brilliant individual person, he'll be able to solve our ventilator problem. And going to the Formula One people, you know, they're brilliant people. Yet actually what's worked is actually working with, oddly enough, people who already made ventilators. Who could have guessed? And they weren't a household name, and they weren't someone who donated money to the Tory party, but they were the best people to go to for ventilators. So I think, you know, this very much ties in with Kay's point about a fairer society. And one of the things that I wrote something for Left Foot Forward on this week, you might have seen there was Denmark announced that it wouldn't be giving bailout money to companies based in tax havens. And actually credit to Poland, which apparently announced the same thing earlier, but no one really noticed. And France, I think, has since followed along the same kind of lines. And you know, what we have to think about, and again, this is the sort of thing that the Green Party has a real role in, because we think long-term and structurally and in terms of systems, is there will be, you know, emergency procedures of things that need to happen really quickly to fix some crisis point around coronavirus. But the choices we make, the decisions we make, we do have a little time to think about them and how they're structured, and they will decide what society looks like on the other side of the coronavirus crisis. And so we need to make sure that we're taking choices, making decisions. You know, Caroline very early on had a very good phrase, is let's make sure we're protecting incomes rather than companies. And, you know, we want to make sure that everyone has an income. And that's why this week we've had the letter and the petition out with, signed by more than 100 MPs and peers from a fairly wide range of parties, although unfortunately no Labor frontbenchers, calling for a recovery UBI. And the basis for this is that, you know, as we start to come out of the crisis, come out of lockdown, different people will be affected differently, and schemes that have picked people up for a while, they'll lose that support, but maybe they still haven't got their job back. And so ensuring you have a recovery UBI that provides the resources for everybody there, you know, this is a huge opportunity to argue for universal basic income, because the whole problem with conditionality, the nature of conditionality, the fact that people fall through the cracks and miss out with the conditionality that's most evident with universal credit, but that we see right across the board with all the government schemes. You know, there's the people who were totally stuck because they're independent contractors and they were just between contracts and they already had a new contract signed, but the government scheme doesn't allow them to claim because they hadn't started the job on the set date. You know, all sorts of people through no fault of their own are utterly falling through the cracks of the system. And so this is a huge opportunity to call for a universal basic income and say, you know, a principle of society should be that no one is left penniless.
Yeah, yeah. I was very impressed with Macron saying that if you don't pay into the system, why should you take any money out, when he joined Denmark and Poland in that. And there was something that came up that one of our larger pub chains is based in the Cayman Islands, and yet they furloughed 18,500 staff that we're paying for. So there is that, yes, we want to support the income of those 18,500, but why should we be doing it on behalf of a firm that isn't registered for tax purposes here? But yeah, okay, good.
Well, actually, just while you mentioned Macron, I will mention that people on the call, at the conference, might be interested in is I was yesterday listening in on a Green European Foundation. They had a European post-corona conference, which you can probably still watch online, and they're having a whole series of them, so that you might want to look. People might want to look them up. And Philippe Lambert's, the Belgian MEP, who I have a lot of time for, he said a nice line of, you know, Macron has suddenly become anti-neoliberal, and it's a real sign of how political times have changed. And, you know, when the neoliberals are on the defensive, said Philippe Lambert's, I step forward and go on the offensive. And that's a very good message, I think, from yesterday.
Right, good. Thank you for that response. Obviously, I've been asking questions and not monitoring chat while it's been coming in. One of the questions that did come in was slightly off the theme, and I was hoping to sort of carry on with the same one. From Ruth, I can't remember exactly who it's from, but the concern is with what is the attitude of the other political parties to the reform of the House of Lords? What are you picking up from within the chamber itself, perhaps, about the possibilities and potential for those future changes?
I think broadly there's quite a bit of support in Labor and Lib Dem, quite a bit of support from the crossbenchers, although there's also quite a bit of opposition from the crossbenchers, because they say with some justice that, you know, their expertise, their skills and their experience, the crossbenchers, you know, some of them, for example, are former High Court judges and that sort of thing. And certainly the whole House very much leans on them with technical things. I mean, Lord Panic, for example, was expressing some very serious changes. I heard concern this week, I heard about changes to extradition procedures and how this set really dangerous legal precedents. And I haven't got my head around the details of this, but, you know, having someone like Lord Panic, who's not a party person, would never be a party person, is useful in the Lords. So I think one of the things we have to do for those crossbenchers is try and create, and that's actually what, if you're interested, if you really have a spare hour and nothing better to do, you can have a look online at the detail of the House of Lords bill, which I can't actually claim any credit for. It was done by Jenny and her people before I started. I just picked it up, but we try to create a structure whereby you would actually encourage the crossbenchers to stand for election, and so actually keep an elected group of crossbenchers. And I think, you know, that's something that we want to try and say we create a structure that helps to keep some of the good elements of the current House of Lords, to get some of the crossbenchers on side. One of the funniest things is actually, surprisingly enough, lots of the hereditaries, because we have about 100 hereditaries. Lots of the hereditaries are actually very keen not to be there, and certainly keen to see reform that gets rid of them. A lot of them are actually, well, some of them anyway, are actually there not because they really want to be, because they feel a sense of obligation so that someone worse doesn't get elected from the tiny pool of people who can be elected in as hereditary, which is not an entirely ridiculous assumption when you look at some of the hereditaries. But I think one of the things that's really important is that the House of Lords is only one side of this. And I've had discussions with Make Votes Matter, the brilliant campaigning organisation, which is, of course, just focused on House of Commons elections. They very explicitly say this is what we do, is House of Commons, and wanting proportional representation in the Commons. And they're concerned that if we just reform the Lords, that people could get away with saying, oh, we'll keep the Commons as it is. My response to that is actually, I think that if you did reform the Lords, you would then create enormous, massive, unbeatable pressure to reform the Commons. Because at the moment, you know, the Lords is the second house, and you want a second house that's the House of Review. You do want the lower house to remain preeminent. You need to keep that balance in bicameral legislatures. But if you made the House of Lords elected by proportional representation, it would then be demonstrably far more democratic than the Commons, and would have far more legitimacy than the Commons had. And so if you did reform the Lords, you'd then immediately have to reform the Commons. So, you know, I don't have any problems arguing with the Lords, but I do point out we have to fix the Commons as well.
Yes, good. What's notable is New Zealand, of course, has a unicameral system and is doing rather well in the current crisis.
Well, yes, there's lots of reasons for that. You know, there's some interesting studies around suggesting that female leaders seem to be doing better than male, and you know, that's a whole complex area. I'm not personally in favour of unicameral. I mean, I was actually talking to some of our MSPs up in Scotland, and that, of course, the Scottish Parliament is unicameral. And one of the things they were saying to me is, because they are both the main legislative governing house and supposedly the House of Review. And if you've got some complicated legislation, say about animal health or something, the people who are MPs who are concerned with, day-to-day politics, fighting elections, serving their constituents, to expect them to go line by line and say, oh, the comma in clause 27B47 is in the wrong place. It really is a different job to do that kind of scrutiny job that the House of Lords is supposed to do. And, to have a break for people to say, hey, hang on a minute, that bit of legislation contradicts that bit of legislation, and to really do that fine work. I think it's difficult to do that in one chamber. I don't know detail about how New Zealand works, but there's potential problems with unicameral.
Yeah, I can see that. Matt Edwards wants me to point out that New Zealand has a much smaller population, of course. So I've done that for you, Matt. That's coming on the chat line. A group of questions that we've got, and I think it's quite a large one. They're coming from various people, but the concern is shared, which is to do with the current crisis, and obviously the much larger one that is currently hiding behind it, the climate crisis. And how are we going to carry forward that climate agenda? Not only once this thing has gone away, but now, while COVID-19 is still there and dominating the headlines.
I think in some ways I've already referred to this, and I did actually write a piece for, can't remember if it was Green World or The Ecologist, one of the two, when COP26 was postponed, because it became obvious that COP26 had to be postponed. It has to be something the world is focused on, this pressing existential issue, and there was just no way the world had the political bandwidth, had the space to get the focus that COP26 needs. But what I was arguing in that piece was that there is potential good in the postponement, not just the obvious practical point about time and bandwidth and attention, but also because, as I said at the start, we have come to recognise that change can happen really, really fast. And there are, within all the tragedy and the death and the sorrow, people are saying, gosh, not just the air's clean, but isn't it nice to be able to walk down the streets and cycle down the streets? I was on one of the first Zoom calls I did, which feels like a very long time ago now. A Headingley Green Party, someone had a virtual background behind them, which was a picture of a street that's normally full of traffic. But now had taken that day, had one cyclist and one jogger on it. We're seeing Caroline Russell down in London is pushing for temporary reshaping of the streets to allow more space for walkers and cyclists, because of course you've got the argument for the need for social distancing. But we've seen Milan, which has said, we don't want to go back to as things were before. We basically want to give our streets over to people, not cars. So there's the understanding that change can happen really, really fast. There's also the understanding that change has to happen. I think there is a quite broad understanding among the public, perhaps not of the technical details, but of the understanding that coronavirus came out of nature and came out of people's abuse of nature and people interacting in negative, damaging ways with nature. That's makes zoonoses, makes diseases coming from animals far more likely. And so it has bred grown an understanding of that we can't continue as we are. We can change very quickly. And we've seen some of the positives of that change can actually deliver that people can physically see. So, I think, I don't have any doubt really that coronavirus will have positive impacts on climate action. Plus, of course, when the European Greens are doing a lot of work pushing this in Europe, there's going to have to be, and everyone accepts there's going to have to be a huge investment program to help societies recover, to get things working again. And there's real opportunities to push the Green New Deal, to push the idea of that's what we need to be doing, is focusing on renewables, home insulation. I spent 4 hours talking about domestic energy efficiency on Thursday, which was fascinating if very long. And so there's huge possibilities there of that investment stream that's going to come online as we start to recover from this one way or another.
Good, yes, yeah. You referred to Bill Walton's photograph of North Lane in Headingley there, and it is very impressive. It was also very impressive that we had a day in Leeds where several roads were closed for the day and pedestrianised. North Lane was one of those, and the feedback from the local residents was very much as the feedback has been about the current changes in traffic patterns. Sort of connected with that and leading on from it, there was a question from Andy Milson in, I think, Bubwith out near York. He said, COVID-19 has prompted huge changes in the behaviour of people that would have seemed impossible before. How can we celebrate those changes and seek to ensure that they're carried on? So again, it's related to the same theme.
Yeah, I think, we've got to always, when we're thinking about particularly public facing stuff, but also when we're thinking about it ourselves, we've got to be a bit careful about tone. And if you look at Jonathan, I think did an interview with GQ that was focusing on, the positive environmental changes. And he started off by acknowledging the pain, the suffering, the stress, the worry, the enormous negative impacts. And we're not in any way saying these things outweigh them. But I think, we don't have to worry about having made that acknowledgement, then moving on to say, well, isn't the air cleaner? Isn't it nicer? Aren't the streets nicer? You've got to be a little careful with this, but, maybe spending time with your children is a nice thing. Maybe a little bit too much time is a bit too much, but, some balance can be achieved in there. So, we really can, focus on the positives while also making sure that we first acknowledge the suffering and the death, and not saying, yay, isn't it great? Because that's not the right tone in the current circumstances.
Yeah, good.
I'd quite like to chip in there. I'm thinking particularly, because I know it's one of your interests as well, about the possible impact on changes in education in the way that our children and others are educated. I wonder if you've got any views on that. This has all brought about enormous changes, and I in my work, I've had some contact with the different schools. So I've got a bit of a feel as to how they've been managing with all of this. So I wonder if you've got any thoughts.
My impression is, and it's a really huge problem that I don't quite know the answer to, is, you know, it's possible to think, oh, we can do education differently in the lockdown, and, you know, whether it's everyone following Joe Wicks, so everyone does physical activity first thing in the morning, and we get more PE into the lessons, or, you know, maybe education becomes less focused on exams and more on, we'll bake a cake and, you know, do some maths while we bake a cake and those sorts of things. I think there is huge structural problems which really haven't been engaged with yet about what's going to happen. You know, we have a whole system that's built around exams, that's built around progress year by year, that's built around an assumption that people have learnt this body of knowledge that they're then going to take into the next body of knowledge. So, you know, I'd like to look on the positive and the focus and see people getting education in different ways. I am really worried about managing, you know, there's cohorts here, just as I was talking about the cohort of NHS workers, you know, people who were down to do GCSEs this year, you know, A levels, university students, you know, what's going to happen to them? Will this cohort always be regarded as the corona cohort who haven't had quite the same education that other years have had? There's some really big problems here that I haven't seen anyone really starting to address in any meaningful way at all. And it's something that's going to have to be put on the list, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. Martin, are there any more questions that have come in?
There was a very gnomic remark that came in from Andy on the chat line about following the Milan and Brighton precedents. I didn't understand that was about. Did you want to comment or enlarge?
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
That's
thank
better,
you.
Andy. Thank you.
Okay, well, I've got my headset now, which works better than the machine. Basically, there's quite a lot of chatter on social media about Vancouver, Berlin, temporary cycle lanes. Brighton's taken an initiative, which when you actually look at it, it's one road on the seafront, so it's not really a great sacrifice, but nevertheless it gives a load of kudos about it. But I don't know if there's opportunity perhaps to share experiences around the region on this, because I'm, as executive member for transport, pushing this and finding a lot of resistance from officers about, and our Lib Dem colleagues as well, of course, in terms of, well, what's the cost going to be? Why do we do it here and not there? And basically, you know, it'd be much easier just not to bother. Yet I have got one of our wards, Micklegate ward, quite a real situation where there's a desperate need for it. We've got small independent shops with a narrow footpath outside. People are walking into the road to get past, people are queuing to get into the shops. It's that sort of situation where, you know, it would be an ideal approach, but officers are saying, well, we might have to go through a legal process and that will take us 2 weeks, and, you know, it might all be not worth bothering about effectively, is what they're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that idea of sharing experiences and knowledge and, you know, you being given the tool that says, well, hey, Brighton's done this without going through that legal procedure, or, you know, as much as we can, sharing experiences and knowledge is a really useful, I mean, under any circumstances, perhaps particularly now, because, you know, there's lots of council officers who are, you know, feeling like they're out of their depths and really struggling and things are really difficult, and you can understand where they're coming from on all of that. So, you know, I think being able to point to them and say, well, you know, why don't you talk to people in this council who we know have just gone ahead and done that? And I think another area where this is really useful, and I've certainly been trying to do a bit of, is democracy, because there seems to be an enormous imbalance around the country between some councils who really acknowledge that democracy has to keep going, and others that have just gone, oh, it's all too difficult, oh, we can't do it, oh, we can't meet in person, that's the end of the day. Now, I actually did some work on the emergency legislation, working with the local government association, and it was put in as a government amendment as a result of pressure that basically allowed councils to do anything, as I understand this is quite technical, but basically do anything that they would normally have done in a physical meeting. They can do anything like that now be done virtually. And, you know, I'll give a call out here to Kirklees Parish Council, which I, of course, saw from the Facebook feed of Andrew Cooper, you know, the grants committee having a meeting virtually. and if I'm not wishing to in any way disparage Kirklees Parish Council, but if Kirklees Parish Council can do it, we're seeing in Sheffield the council that's just virtually running things by diktat. Why can't Sheffield do, at least as well as Kirklees Parish Council is doing, is a question you can really use, I think, very powerfully. And that applies to road closures or changes or anything else. That comparative tool is a really useful one.
Yeah, I think it's Kirkburton Parish Council. Just
okay, sorry.
I think it's where Andrew hangs out. We're running quite close to time, and it's one of the questions I was expecting to come in, and it's only just come in, which is the HS2 one, which is obviously an issue that affects our region. I nearly said county. Our region quite dramatically, and where the go-ahead has been given behind, the sort of cover of COVID-19. Any views on that, or do you think it is inevitable it's going to go ahead now, at least as far as Bennett?
I think it's still very much worth fighting. And in fact, I've seen I'm sure many people will have seen some horrific social media reports of, badger cubs being running from a set that was being dug up, and, very old oak trees being cut down with birds' nests in them. And I'm actually going to be talking to Jenny and Caroline and seeing if either house we might be able to do some kind of emergency thing about this. It's never simple or easy, and it's a case of trying to work out what the best mechanism is, but we'll certainly be working on that. But no, I think, HS2 is still very much worth fighting. And, the very obvious point is, the issue of change and things not being the same after coronavirus as before. It's become very obvious that it's not that every single meeting will be replaced by Zoom. We all might sort of go slightly cross-eyed if that was to happen. But, a lot of the travel that we used to do it's obvious that, we really didn't have to do it. It didn't need to be done. Lots of people are going to be reassessing their priorities. The whole economic structure is going to change, is going to relocalize, certainly to, a significant degree. So all of the assessments and the assumptions behind HS2, the whole thing was very, very dodgy anyway, just on pure economic terms. But, in the new world, the idea that things will just continue as they are, it's my intention to keep fighting that. I have a lovely collection of HS2 trolls on Twitter who I, manage to stir up several times a week. I can't say I entirely enjoy it, but I'm going to keep doing it. And it's certainly worth keeping fighting. And, what needs to be done, coming back to Andy's point about, changing to local transport, changing local arrangements. That's clearly where the focus needs to be and where the money needs to go. And so, I'm not giving up on HS2. I'm going to keep fighting and fighting. The problem is there is a point, and it's difficult now because usually we'd be slowing things down with direct action and, doing things that under social distancing just aren't physically possible. But, it's still, it's all up for grabs and it's still there to play for, and I'm going to keep fighting it. And, in the House of Lords, there's already quite a balance set up. We have Andrew Adonis as the man who's been the long-time proponent, and me as the person who's the long-time opponent. And I expect that battle to be resumed quite soon.
Good,
right.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Asking you to keep fighting it, so thanks very much for that. I'll pass back to Anne now to close the session, and thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Martin, for monitoring the questions coming in and for answering them. Thank you very much indeed, Natalie, for that very, very wide-ranging discussion, as you said. So just give us a little flavour of what your week ahead looks like on Zoom or whatever other channel you do, just to close.
Well, I spend my life on a whole alphabet soup of, I had a webinar jam I was on with Fashion Revolution this morning, which was my first time on that one. I'm up to about 10 different video conferencing things, but Zoom is probably the most common one. I'm probably coming in on Tuesday on an oral question actually about dairy farms and dairy prices, and I'll be using that to talk about the risk of the whole crisis seeing a shift even further towards factory farming and away from small independent farms. This afternoon, I actually have to I did a Speakers for Schools event on plastics, and then using that to talk about the environment in general and making politics what you do, aimed at 11 to 14-year-olds. And I got 450 questions on that. So
Wow.
they've sent me a selection of about 25 of those. So I've got it this afternoon, I've got to write those up.
Right.
And then on Thursday, I've got the oral question on growth and the debate on universal basic income. So it's going to be a busy week.
Very busy. Right, so thank you very much indeed again. Thank you to everybody who's posed questions and put discussions in as well. I'll hand back to Tom for the